Welcome to the Humour in Games podcast, an analog and video games podcast about how humor is experienced, designed, and analyzed in games.
We are Scott DeYoung,
Mark Lajeunesse,
and Andre Zanescu,
and we'll be your guides in this 6-episode series. Throughout each episode, we'll break down different theories and forms of humor. We'll draw on interviews with designers, critics, and academics as they discuss the different aspects of humor, their own lived experiences, and how their work utilizes humor in games. This week, we met with Dr. Pippin Barr, a game maker, educator, and critic whose various projects challenge our understandings of what games might even be.
Pippin, who are you?
Who is Pippin Barr? So let me just do a nice straight-faced little intro. I'm Pippin Barr. I'm an assistant professor at Concordia University and the associate director of the Technoculture Art and Games Research Center. But the main thing I usually say I do is make experimental games, some of which are funny. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. To get to your question, though, this whole thing of like what makes a game funny, like as soon as I got your email and I started thinking about this, I definitely have been developing significant anxiety around my ability to answer that question. I think some of it is, I think it's going to be interesting for you moving forward with all of your interviews. There's a bit of a, pornography thing of, I know it when I see it. I think that goes on with humor and comedy. And when you try and drill down, it's kind of like, I don't know, like a cloud or something, kind of like a vapor. So I don't, like my first pass answer is that I don't actually really know, or at least I don't know that I can put it into smart sounding words. And then the next thing that I did was immediately, I wrote a paper with Claire Dorman and Robert Biddle, God knows how long ago. I've got it on my desktop. I guess I can find out when it's from. But it is old. 2006. Well, goodness me. Called The Laughter and the Slaughter, which was a paper very specifically about humor in video games. Claire Dorman was looking into humor theory, so that was the other kind of direction I was immediately thinking about. It's like, what is humor? I don't even think that I know beyond, I laugh at some jokes, which is not a sophisticated position. And so, I started looking at that. And it's also, we can talk about that later. And I know that you've got you had a question along those lines, and perhaps you know more than I do about these things. But there are, theories of what humor is and how humor functions. So I guess that's another way of answering that question. And tying it to video games. What do you think humor is? How does it work in video games?
Oh no, you're putting me on the spot now?
Why not?
Unexpected. Well, we've sort of been talking about it for a couple weeks now, and there is a lot of writing, and Mark has gone through a lot more of it than I have, but there's a lot of ways to go about it, right? Some people seem to think about it visually, or in terms of positionality, or in terms of the activities that are involved. It seems to, the wellspring seems to be so widely varied that, it's one of those things of even personally, you sort of, it when you see it, or this is funny and I'm not really sure why, is I think a really interesting way to go about it. So maybe to deflect back onto you, maybe what is sort of your brand of humor, or things that make you laugh that don't necessarily have to be game related, I suppose.
God, that seems very personal.
Oh no.
That's an interesting question. I mean, like obviously everybody's got a ton of different stuff that they find funny. I was thinking about this too. Like, do I have some specific kind of humor that I tune into? But I don't know. Like, I suspect I'm pretty conventional in terms of consuming humor. I've only very recently, whether or not it's pathetic, I don't know, but only recently started looking at TikTok over the last little while, and that's, as far as I can tell, like mostly a platform for people doing slapstick sorts of comedy. And a lot of that's pretty funny. I mean, I've definitely enjoyed time with TikTok and people sort of singing along to songs or acting out these bizarre skits where they use the long face filter and the vibrato effect on their voices to have these recreations of disputes with their parents. So, I mean, obviously humor is a thing that's constantly changing, and it's pretty specific to, I don't know, to specific context. So a platform like TikTok comes across very differently to Curb Your Enthusiasm or some Hollywood blockbuster comedy movie, all of which I find funny and laugh at. I was looking at my own games again, you know, trying to like do some due diligence for this thing and find out what it is that I've been doing since, let me scroll down to the bottom here, in 2010 apparently. And one thing that I noticed, I mean, this is sort of, that's relevant but slightly depressing, is that since maybe 2017, I looked at the games and I was like, oh yeah, I really stopped trying to be as funny. Like humor sort of was no longer the mainline point of the stuff I was making from about 2017, maybe earlier. I don't know. And then this is the thing that got me into, maybe it's 2016. God. This is the thing that then got me into thinking more about what is it about humor, and maybe the distinction between humor and comedy as well.
Yeah.
In my earlier stuff, I'll just talk about myself and try not to feel weird about it. A lot of the point was comedy, like presenting games that maybe were primarily about, like, this is a funny situation that you find yourself in, that kind of thing. An airplane crash, or you're, you know, God trying to deal with this with humanity. Not that an airplane crash isn't inherently funny, but being helpless in the face of an airplane crash as a video game player is an interesting position to be in. And I think over time, what I've always been interested in, really, really below any sense of comedy, is about creating video games that are incongruous in some way, in the context of whatever. There's not really any such thing as standard or totally conventional video games anymore. But to the extent that you can still imagine a kind of platonic video game that is, you know, multiplayer, fair and balanced. It's about combat, you know, who shoots who, etc. Yeah, it's a straw person, but nonetheless, you know, it still kind of functions. I've always been interested in creating video games that were in some kind of weird opposition to that. And so to a large extent, I think that the idea of humor or comedy for me has generally, there is a specific theory of humor, right, which is the incongruity theory of humor. I sound educated, but like I only just read this morning from that paper from 2006, maybe outdated by now. That idea that you laugh at things or you find things funny because they're not what you expect, or they're like kind of the wrong thing at the wrong moment, those sorts of things. And I think a lot of the kinds of stuff that I've done in my games, not all of them, I've tried to make a couple of legitimately serious games that have no obvious room for humor, but a lot of what ends up happening is that I make a game that diverges from what you should do according to game design principles or conventions, and that in itself ends up being kind of funny, at the very least to me, because I mean I find it funny to do this kind of work, but also to at least some players, just because it doesn't match expectations.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you mention, but that you've been going through them with a fresh eye, because I feel sort of a bit in the same way. I feel like we maybe have talked about this in the past, but when I started studying games, the first games that they had us play were your Greek Punishment series, which seemed more frustrating to me at the time, but replaying them now, sort of the UI version especially, just made me chuckle, because they're they just seem to be sort of, they're incongruous in ways that I would not expect. Like the presentation can be incongruous, or the game goals.
Mhm.
And I know if Mark wants to chime in, or I can go with this.
I think you're on your own.
The artist is present is also a game that I think maybe intentionally or unintentionally humorous in
Mhm.
much the same way. Especially the going through the sort of the pixelated world, and maybe we should, when we have a final edit of this, we should footnote with the actual the game about Marina Abramovich's art exhibit at the Met. Famous has a documentary, I think, it's online. I don't know where it is, but sort of the experience of having this very intimate face-to-face experience, but then the person looking back at you is 16 or 32-bit sprite seems hilarious to me. And so, I mean, you've sort of verged on the question that we had later, how do you approach making a game funny? And it seems like you're very obviously thinking about it, but also that it may not always be the primary goal of the game that you're making. I don't know if that
Yeah, I mean,
tracks with the way you feel.
that tracks. I think that those are some good words. I think like a thing that I was thinking about, I guess it was yesterday, with a lot of these games, and the artist is present, although I hate the fact that it is, remains the emblematic game that I made when it was 2011, which is depressing. It's a good example in that I think a lot of what I end up doing is the initial idea for any of my games tends to be mostly, not always, but mostly really stupid. Like it's a bad idea in some, in some sense, in the sense of a game. Like a game about going to a museum and waiting in a queue and sitting in a chair is a bad idea in a conventional sense. But then what I've often then tried to do is go and sort of very earnestly follow it through pretty deeply, and to kind of, I guess, to go all the way with that and not just think of it, but to execute. And so that basic comedy of, part of the comedy is, I guess, is literally the idea that somebody made this and somebody spent all of this time, elaborately constructing this really stupid experience that's not fun and like is not interesting or whatever. But it sort of starts as a bad idea, but then as is usually the case, I guess, when you make anything or when you do research or whatever, if you pursue something in enough depth and with enough commitment, you usually end up finding out that it's, that it has the depth that you're exploring, and that it is an interesting thing to do. So the artist is present started as like I will, aggressively make a game that nobody will enjoy, but to me turned out to be, a very interesting exploration of, things that video games are good at, things that they're limited at, such as, having a deep emotional connection with a non-existent other. Like it tends to, well, I mean, people who play things like Mass Effect and Dragon Age may disagree, but in my opinion, it's not a thing that games are great at. And so this is the perfect, like, sort of quintessential, pure example of that idea.
Yeah.
In video game form. And so it's, like I think that a lot of the comedy comes in really, really executing and like going all the way into the idea, not just having that initial, maybe not very good idea.
So to build on that a little bit, and also to move into games that have happened since the artist is present, one.
Hey, wonderful.
Because there is a 2, which
there is a 2.
Conceptually might be interesting because it is sort of like revisiting your prior work, and so
Mm-hmm.
on the one hand, I'm curious how that works, if it's funnier because it is a re-exploration, or if it's more a reflection on what the first one brought up for you. But also on a much more abstract scale, you've been doing a multiple series on chess,
Uh-huh.
and chess with strange rules, which I suppose people listening to this might not imagine as humorous, but it can be. And so do you feel like the chess series also started from this idea of I'm going to take a very bad idea and earnestly apply it to
That's
the
a fair
maximum?
question. It's a little hurtful, but it's fine.
I personally really like them and I think they're hilarious, but I'm just using your words.
Of course you are. Yes, and you're using them to hurt me. So the Chesses series, no, like I honestly don't think. I'm looking at the initial set, which was, I actually, I think an interesting thing about the Chesses series maybe is that I didn't, I mean, they are a bad idea in some sense because almost none of them are playable in an interesting way. That whole series really started with Gravity Chess, which is a chess that's kind of rotated sideways and the pieces fall downwards when you make moves. Which it's not super playable. It's more playable than you might expect. And like one of the things that I've been interested in, I guess maybe a bit more recently, is that I'm not a good game designer in a traditional sense of making a game that's fun to play for more than 2 to 3 minutes or less if you go by the statistics on my analytics. But I was interested in that idea of exploring a really pure form of game design. I think we're gonna end up off track in terms of humor. So I guess I would say I didn't think that they were especially funny. The one of those that captured people's imaginations the most, well, Gravity Chess was one, and the other was the Fog of War version in the sequel, Chesses 2, good name. Both of which I guess they play on this kind of incongruity thing again, right? Like there's at the very least, there's this moment, and it really plays into the whole animated GIF-ification of indie games, especially in Twitter, where you have to communicate like how amazing your game is in a looping GIF. And often that's all that people will perceive about your game at all. Both the Gravity Chess, because there's the moment where you make the first move and the piece falls down. That's literally like a Looney Tunes thing with Wile E. Coyote or something falling off a cliff.
Yeah.
And Fog of War, where you suddenly realize that it's taken one of the rules from something like Civilization and applied it to chess. But people actually found that semi-exciting, which is nice as well. Like that wasn't just laughable. That was like, oh, actually, maybe this is kind of cool. So that was nice for me. But a lot of them, obviously, they very heavily trade on the idea that chess is a very known quantity. And although chess itself has tons of variations dating back, decades and decades, because people have been fiddling with it, for most people who don't play much chess, they don't know that, and B, they don't really get the chance to see that kind of thing. So any instance of seeing chess, which seems kind of untouchable, behaving in a different way to what you might expect, it's sort of lightly funny, not hilarious. Like I don't think that those are like my funniest games or anything, but there's just something funny to seeing something not do what you would expect.
Well, I think that's actually much more on the mark with humor than everyone might think, because I find myself very often not outright laughing at mechanics. Hilarity for me, or drop on the floor laughter is so rare, but very often I'll have like a small chuckle, or you're playing by yourself and you're smiling at the game because there is something humorous. Mm-hmm. And I find it's very interesting to me that certain types of games might have jokes that are meant to make you laugh a lot at one instance, and other games might be sort of suffused, peppered with this sort of lower intensity humor that is active at all times. I personally found Gravity Chess to be hilarious, and I tried to show it to my dad, who's an avid chess and backgammon player, and he just started laughing, and his exact words to me were, "No one would play chess like that." Which evidently, no, I don't think that's the point. But there is something contextual in the humor that it made me laugh because of, I think, sort of thinking about video games combined with chess, and for him who is not thinking, he's just looking at it like a traditional chess,
Mm-hmm.
it just did not really work for him. Right?
In a funny way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I think that's very fair. Yeah, and like I think a great thing, well, a thing that I've always been interested in, and it does speak to humor as well as other things, is trying to make games that are accessible to people outside the really hardcore. I know about video games. I test all my games with my parents, which in itself is a piece of comedy. But yeah, it's great that your dad can at least get access to the basic one-liner of this is ridiculous.
Yeah. So I mean, do you ever feel when you're designing all your games? I know you heavily document, or at least you more than I do when I'm making things. You're taking sort of production notes, right? Each of your games sort of has a
tons actually. Yeah, the most recent game is like 10,000 words of. Well, maybe no, it's probably closer to 20,000 words of writing about it as I go. Yeah, it's intense.
So do you ever feel like you hit a threshold in humor, but also sort of in the objectives that you've set up, where you're writing in your notes and you're thinking, okay, this game is now, the core concept is where I want it to be at, or the humorous aspect is where I want it to be at, or is it just sort of a free-form process and it ends up where it ends up for you?
It's a really interesting question. Off the top of my head, what do I think about that? I think with most, is this going to be true? With most of the stuff that I make, I usually have a pretty clear idea of what it's meant to be early on. Just because most of the games I make, they're sort of simple out of necessity because I'm making them on my own, and I'm not a lead programmer. I'm just like a programmer, and I don't really make, can't do amazing graphics, et cetera. So the scale being small is important practically. But also I think smaller scale work lends itself. I mean, if I'm being highfalutin, I would say that most of the stuff that I'm making certainly can involve humor, but most of what I'm trying to push for is thoughtfulness about game design on the part of the player. Like a lot of it's it's kind of navel-gazy, right? But most of the stuff is about game design itself in some capacity. So because each game has that as its core kind of question, they're kind of saturated in some sense almost immediately, and making the game is somewhat about finding out, like, well, how do I achieve this thing? And because I don't work on them for very long until I had a child, and now games take forever to produce. I don't. It's not a sort of a cumulative thing where I'm like, oh, now I think it's finished. It's like I know what it needs to be, and at a certain point, I just release it because I can't be bothered working on it anymore.
Yeah.
That's not a great answer. Yeah, but
no, I think it's a fair answer. It doesn't have to be.
It is fair. Yeah, and I promised myself that I would just be honest.
I mean, sort of maybe a riff on that question and the incongruity talk that we were having earlier. I'm curious, these games have obviously a sort of a central vector for you. There's something that you're thinking about or you're trying to express with them. Mm-hmm. Do you ever feel like the incongruity that arises out of the entire mix of the game sort of overrides your initial design intention?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know, because to some extent that's really a function of the player's experience and whether they get it in the way that I sort of thought that they would get it. So I guess it's true that that's bound to happen. But that really speaks to, I guess, the other thing that I think is really important or interesting potentially about humor in games and any kind of communication in games, like any time that a game is trying to tell you something, whether it's a joke or a serious heartbreaking story or something, is that idea that it's kind of a shared thing between, sort of not completely between designer and player, because you're speaking through the incredibly imperfect instrument of the game. But I've always tried to think about making work as a sharing kind of experience between me and a notional player. It's kind of weird too, because I then often have spoken in the past and still kind of feel like I don't really care a lot about the reception of a game until, especially once I get tenure, hopefully next year. But at the same time, that's sort of my design philosophy is around that. It's about this idea that the game isn't meant to tell you what it's about, or like instruct you or boss you around, and it's not, at least it's not meant to be totally opaque either, although I suspect a lot of my stuff ends up being kind of opaque, in part because I don't play test and I don't really talk to people about what I'm doing. But there's that middle ground, which is that it's meant to be kind of a shared joke, right? Like Gravity Chess, it's like ideally somebody's telling you a joke, but you're kind of in on it, and that part of the work that's being done is by the player kind of to be in on the joke and to enjoy it, not to have a joke kind of sprung on them or forced on them.
Yeah.
I think that that's super important, and I think that that's also true of the sort of the more formal objective of my stuff, which is I want to make, especially lately, I've been very interested in making games that are about game design, and so correspondingly, I guess what I'm interested in is players getting this opportunity potentially to sort of think about game design while they play a game. And maybe the humor does end up overriding some of that, because they just sort of, they have the laugh or whatever, like your dad, right? You have a laugh, but you don't really think about any implications of, what if the pieces did fall down? Like, why is that bad game design? Or what could happen? If you just laugh and move on, then that conversation doesn't happen. So it could be that it deflects more serious thoughts sometimes.
Yeah. This is super interesting because you mentioned thinking about yourself as a notional player in the design process. So I'm imagining you're making the game thinking, if I was a player, how would this game look to me? And now making games for players that are about your process, your interior process of thinking about design. We had a more general question, but you can tie this to your own work. And
I'm sure I will.
Do you feel like live streaming, or I suppose maybe a better way to think about this is a secondary audience has changed the way that your games are being received, or that the humor is being communicated? So for instance, if I were playing your game on a live streaming platform for another audience to view it, or if I'm showing it in a class, do you feel like that changes what you wanted the game to be?
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I saw that question at the end of that list that you sent ahead of time, and was sort of both struck with fear, because it's not an area that I know a lot about. I've watched a little bit of Twitch stuff, but like I've never gotten into it in a way that I would say that I really understand the culture or totally what's going on with it. But I do think it's a really interesting larger phenomenon to sort of not shockingly not talk about myself for a second. It's that idea of games as performative, that they're a thing that you can kind of use as an instrument for some purpose for other people. I guess often, like, I don't know what that world looks like, but I assume at least often for comedic effect. Like, I mean, I know, people play horror games and it's all about how hilarious their terrified reactions are, or things like that. I guess my touchstone for this actually would probably be Kaiser Mario, which I have watched a large number of playthroughs of. Most obviously, there's the you're familiar with Kaiser Mario, right? Maybe we should gloss it, I guess, right? That it's a version of, I think it's Super Mario Brothers, that has been, it's levels designed for Super Mario Brothers that are insanely difficult. That's kind of their primary objectives. They're very, very hard and the story being that they were designed by a master Super Mario level designer for their friend who was extremely good at the game. And so they can accomplish all kinds of things with their little Mario that the average human barely understands. So the sort of the core premise is that it's this very difficult Mario experience which you're watching, and you're watching a virtuoso navigate it and work out how to conquer the various challenges. But I guess it's in the nature of Mario to some extent for any player, but especially in this context, it's all kind of slapstick as well. Like there's lots of, obviously you see this expert player fail constantly because the game is just so insanely difficult. From hidden invisible blocks where they manage to execute some like wonderful leap off a cliff, bounce off a Goomba's head, but then there's an invisible block placed perfectly which just catapults them down off the bottom of the screen, and it's just funny. Maybe especially because they're so good, right? It's like seeing a super duper athlete trip over a banana skin or something while they're about to score a touchdown or whatever kind of metaphor we want there. So definitely, I definitely get that idea of using games as a way of delivering comedy, whether or not the game itself is designed for comedy. And it's just as clear from something like Kaizo Mario that you can design the game towards comedy for performance specifically. Returning, of course, to myself, it's not something that I've really ever thought about, except when I got kind of vaguely irked when Robert Yang, and he still talks about this actually, Robert Yang, the queer game designer, gay game designer really, talked about this idea that his games didn't need to be played to kind of work, that they all had this core concept, usually at least in some way pretty funny. He's a pretty funny guy. But that you didn't need to play them. And so it was almost like a total refinement of this idea of all you needed to do was watch like an animated GIF or even simulate the idea of the game in your head, and that performance was sufficient. And that always bugged me. Like I've always felt like you should actually, that the experience of play matters. I can't necessarily articulate why, and he's probably smarter than me, so maybe he's right. But like, there's that idea that, maybe you do have to play the game, and but perhaps that the game can be played for you and you can watch is an interesting thing. I guess I feel like, I guess it could be interesting. I don't know. Like I've never watched anybody play one of my games really with any seriousness because it's too nerve-wracking. But I could imagine you could play them in a funny way or something. Like it makes sense to me. I don't know if anybody has.
Well, thinking about the way that you're thinking about it, one of the really interesting parts for me is we've been talking a lot about incongruity, and I'm sure we'll get to maybe a bit more theory in a little bit, but the games are funny because they're incongruous or they defy expectations, or to me, Let's Play Greek Punishment did that in so many ways, because the games are meant to be unwinnable, but there's every time you've released a new version, I've always tried to see if there is one. There is a way to. But we played them the first time we played them in an undergraduate class, and so there was a lot of humor to me, or it was very funny to see people in the class trying to win after you realize that that's not the purpose of the game and getting frustrated. And so there's maybe there's an emergent aspect of superiority theory where you're laughing at the other players because they haven't gotten the joke yet, and that's a secondhand joke. I don't know.
That's a mean joke. Yeah, I mean,
mean undergrads.
Yeah, it makes sense. It totally makes sense to me. It's definitely, again, like I said, because I don't really test games, and I don't really pay a lot of attention to people's play. It's so stupid. Like I really need to get into this stuff now. As I say it, I just think, what a dick. Like get it. But like I don't think about those sort of second level social aspects, I guess, of play. I'm like, whether because I'm kind of hermity or like antisocial or whatever. But yeah, it didn't even occur to me that that would be a kind of emergent property of a game, is that you can kind of, it's like the Penn and Teller, was it Smoke and Mirrors games or whatever they were called, with games that you kind of inflicted on your friends because you knew the secret about them. Like Desert Bus was one of these.
Yeah.
But your friend didn't know, and so you'd watch them and kind of laugh at them like, behind your head or whatever as they, attempted to do the impossible. I guess the only thing for me, and like the thing that it doesn't bug me, but like those games, they're based on these ancient Greek myths about eternal punishment. And it always vaguely surprised me that anybody thought that you would be able to win them. Like it's just like, that would be ahistorical.
Well, I mean, it's sort of the, does the package, the game package, or the idea that it has to be a game override the content, right?
Absolutely.
Or vice versa.
I mean, of course, being facetious, but that, and I think that, it's that tension that is, that's where the comedy kind of comes out of, right?
Yeah. I mean, so we've been talking a lot about the games that, I'm speaking for my co-researchers because we've talked about this, but the games that we thought were funny when we played them, or games that are humorous out of your catalog, or do you agree with that? Because you did mention being a bit irked by people mentioning the artist is present a lot.
Oh no, I mean that's totally funny. Like that's the original. In many ways, I would say that's kind of the original game where I was like, oh, that would be funny to make that game. There's not many games. I was looking through my list actually, just sort of trying to find like where are the very serious games, and there's not many. Like I mean, there's like I've tried and it's difficult, and like maybe it's just because I've built such a brand around not taking things seriously, but a series of Gunshots, which was a game I made about sort of gun violence in games. Like, as I definitely didn't make that one for the laughs. Like, it's meant to be incredibly stark, and indeed the entire point of that game in some ways was about stripping away any kind of feedback that you could get any juice out of, to a point where it was literally just this really depressing experience of unseen violence. It's really dark. Like I think it's really successfully a very dark game. But that's and there's a couple of other things where I've the VR games like the Water Museum. But even that is kind of like, again, it's kind of incongruous. So there is a bit of comedy there. I didn't make it as a comedy game. I made it the Water Museum because it's interesting. But then also just some of the things I'm interested in are kind of laughable.
Do you want to talk about the Water Museum for a second?
So one of the funny things about the Water Museum, actually, there it is. So it's the premise for all of our listeners, our hundreds and nay thousands of listeners who have not played VR3, which you can play on my website, is that it's this virtual museum of water. The water is all inside these little museum-y plinths, and you kind of walk amongst them, and you can just look at the water. I mean, that is funny, I guess. Like it didn't occur to me particularly that was a particularly funny thing, but it is kind of funny. And so the core premise is to look at water for its own sake. Like the serious version of this is that water in video games is this quite beautiful technical accomplishment. There's different kinds, and that we rarely really stop to look at it in games and think about it in its own, just for itself, rather than as some kind of like part of gameplay or just something that we have to traverse or something like that. So that was the serious version. In reality, there's a kind of cumulative like madness, I guess, that comes in just looking at a whole bunch of different waters. And the game itself is kind of taking itself so seriously that I guess that's also kind of silly. But when I was making it, it was particularly amazing because I was kind of like the gallery technician for this virtual museum, and I had to like get the water into the plinths. And that was super difficult. Like it's this thing that should have been, I assumed it would be really easy. I thought this game was going to take a few days, and it took months. Hugely because the water was so ridiculously hard to get to cooperate. Like some of it, you'd have this nice water and you put it in the plinth, and then it would just go flat and it wouldn't do anything. That was a classic thing. So it was like, I could leave it like that, obviously, because that's the, whatever, that's the underlying truth of this water, is that when you put it in the plinth, it's flat. But I wanted it to look like it looked earlier. And then some of the other water just went out of control. It flooded the gallery at one point. It just kind of like wouldn't stay in the plinth, so it just went out to the horizon. This is kind of post-apocalyptic flood thing. And then another one became aggressively spiky, and it was quite scary to look at. There's all kinds of stuff that happened, none of which is in the game. It would be interesting to make a sequel that was sort of more about that. But just the misbehavior of water technology was kind of private to me, right? Because I was the only one witnessing it. I put a few GIFs up on Twitter, I think. But yeah, that was funny. Like, I think technology, and it's incongruity again, right? It's like technology not doing what you expect is pretty funny, so long as you're not enraged and trying to finish a game, at which point it really stopped being funny a few times. But I was able to laugh a couple of times at least.
So, I mean, maybe to wrap back to what we were talking about earlier, the Water Museum is very interesting to me because the way you're talking about it is very much about viewing. It's how you see the water. It's very textural. It's visual, and the way you expect it to behave, and it might not be the way that it does behave. So I'm curious. I'm stuck on the comment you made earlier about games not needing to be played necessarily. Where maybe we can talk a little bit more about why it would be important to play this to get that experience as opposed to just viewing. Or I suppose the sub question is, why does play matter to you?
Jesus. Yeah.
Sorry, this is a big question, but
well, I mean, maybe that's a good example. So Robert, I don't want to I'm sure many other people agree with Robert Yang, and he's not like the only person who thinks this idea that at least some conceptual games, which I think is arguably what I make as well. If anything, I would say that the stuff that I make is way more kind of ends up being more conceptual and airy than Robert's stuff, which is so technically beautiful and kind of accomplished. But anyway, with VR3, I think that the thing is you could clearly just say that you made a museum of water and have a couple of screenshots of a room with water and plinths, and people would be like, oh yeah, okay, well that's a thing, and I guess I get that that's interesting because you would go in hypothetically and look at the water, and maybe that would you could look at water for a while and then you'd be finished, and I get it. But I think, and this is, I think I was sort of talking about this earlier, this whole thing of like really following through on an idea. Like part of that I think maybe applies to play as well. Like, I mean, you have to be at least a little bit accountable as a player and kind of commit to what you're doing, or you can't expect to have an interesting experience or to really get much depth out of a game. Like, and I do this all the time with games. Like, I don't really engage enough to enjoy them. And that's, I don't know, I kind of feel like that's my fault. I think there's a tendency to blame the game or the designers or the graphics or whatever, and to say, that's why you didn't have an interesting experience with something. But a lot of the time it's on us as players as well. Maybe Death Stranding. I'm feeling guilty about Death Stranding. But however, let's not go into that. So with VR3, I mean, to return to the specific example, one of the things that I think really emerges both for me in making and sort of following through on that idea of exhibiting water, exhibiting different kinds of water, and for a player of the game, is that as you do literally play it, and why play matters, at least in that specific context, is that a lot of what's interesting in that game is comparison and building up a kind of, whether it's explicit or not, a language about the water and an understanding of how water works technically, what it might look like, what are some commonalities between different waters, why certain waters look the way they look. Like, one of the biggest things that comes up for me whenever I replay that game is how shitty some of the water is. especially like the water that's trying, I guess it's trying to be from like a JRPG game or something. It's really flat. It's just like caustics moving around. And then in particular, one of the important things about the game is that some of the water wasn't free. So the early water that gets displayed is free, and then the later water is more and more expensive. And so you get this whole thing of like, that's funny, like that's literally one of the funniest things about the game is how terrible the most expensive water looks. Or like, why is this like really basic looking flat water so expensive? And it turns out it's sort of because it's optimized for mobile devices, and you can work that out by reading the plinth. So I guess there's a lot of detail and there's a lot of work to be done. And it's just like, this is starting to expand into the entire argument about contemporary art, especially, right? Or any art that's not just about aesthetics, visual aesthetics, is that you have to do work. Like the audience has to do work. And a good game or a good piece of art is, making that work available to them, and just hopefully that it's rewarding to do it because there's something to get on the other end. And I guess when you make a game, and probably when you paint a painting or whatever it is that you do, you're putting all of that stuff in, and hopefully you can kind of detect that stuff's going in as you realize, you buy the crappy water and you're like, this is really crappy. That's bizarre to me. I'm definitely going to include it because that's an interesting thing about water in video games. And then I guess you just hope that the people who play the game get there as well.
Yeah. I think that's super interesting because in some sense, it really is about humor. To me, can come out of that sort of audience work or, sort of filling in the blanks. And it can happen, I think, with written text, and it happens one way, or if you're a live performance, it happens another, or in a film. Then maybe play is just the way that is specific to games. I'm sort of allergic to the argument that games are somehow better than other forms of media. I just think they're different, but...
Yeah, they seem distinct, I agree. Better is like, it's a bit of a pointless argument. But yeah, there is a special thing that you're doing in games that you're clearly not doing in other media, and presumably that leads to some kind of slightly different experience of humor as well.
Yeah. So to diverge away from this discussion that has been wonderful, but we did mention that we were going to talk a little bit about theory.
Oh yeah, sure.
Too, and that piece. Well, I mean, so we've talked a lot about incongruity theory, right? So the idea that things are funny because they don't match up to expectations or because they're weird and in context they don't fit. But is that generally the sort of, if you have a theoretical inclination of the kind of humor that you like in games, or do you include other forms?
I mean, I don't include any theory when I make stuff. I think if I'm reviewing the history of stuff that I've done, it seems like the best fit. Like when I reread the Laughter and the Slaughter paper this morning, it occurred to me just as well that the incongruity thing almost feels like it's the only one that's sort of that you can operationalize. I guess as somebody who thinks sort of primarily in the form of design and development of game-like stuff, I'm looking for stuff that you can actually do. Whereas both relief humor and, the other one, which is about being a dick, which I can't remember the name.
Superiority.
Superiority humor. Like neither of them feel sort of like they felt a bit kind of vague to me, and they were more about the social function of humor rather than just like what's funny. So I find those ones a little bit more like probably I could apply those ideas to some of my work, although maybe there's such an absence a lot of the time of actual people or characters. But like maybe superiority humor could be applied to the ancient Greek punishment series, right? To the extent that it's a real punching down on Sisyphus and Prometheus and so forth, except that you're them, so you're kind of the subject of the superiority humor or something. But maybe that's funny to be put in that position because it's incongruous, or I don't know. So I struggle with the other theory.
Yeah, and on the point of the bug, I remember you have a piece with Rilla and Jonathan, I think about
Which one?
the hot and cold design sort of discussion, and I think
Oh,
there's
yeah, sure.
a piece of it where you're talking about things that sort of unexpectedly arise just in the making process, or things that you decide now have to stay. Like they were unexpected, they weren't intended, but in this sort of computational vein, right? They're
Yeah, that's interesting. Like that's sort of, it's almost like the computer tells you a joke and then you steal it or something like that. Yeah,
it's a good way to put it. Yeah.
yeah, that completely makes sense to me. I mean, I guess you, as a developer, want to vaguely think like you're constantly in control of what happens, but it's very true that you are not, and that, yeah, if you can, I don't know, it's just, yeah, it's often hard for me, I think, to tell. So a lot of things that happen when you're developing a game, and like I would need to read more about this computational humor stuff to have better language, but certainly a lot of the stuff that happens is funny to me as a developer who, I guess, again, I know what was meant to happen and the computer did something else. Haha. It's a little harder to know when, I guess, you can include that for the enjoyment of a player. Like, yeah, when does it cross that line into something that's accessible to people who maybe, aren't programmers and therefore maybe aren't gonna understand what's funny about an infinite loop or something along those lines. Like one example actually is that in the ancient Greek punishment games, at some point I realized I didn't have an option to escape to the menu, which is like a normal thing that you would implement, and then kept it, right? Because it's like, yeah, why would you be able to like escape to the menu of infinite punishments? So stuff does design itself, in that case through omission, I guess, right?
Yeah. That's great. Oh my God. I feel I suppose we're reaching maybe the 1 hour mark, so I don't want to keep you much longer.
Oh yeah,
And I also want to thank you because this is sort of this might be things that are very difficult to verbalize. I'm sort of asking we're asking you to explain the joke for most of your design process. So I guess the sort of the wrap-up question is there something that you would have wanted to talk about, or a question you wish we would have asked you that we didn't, or something
yeah.
that you want to talk about now?
It's always the appropriate final question. I actually think that you got pretty good coverage there. Let me just have a quick look at this list of stuff. Funny games. Ha ha ha. Blah 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 blah. I mean, you did have that question, which I thought was, perceptive, or at least, it's interesting, and maybe it might be too big of a subject, but it is interesting that question of whether humor has a cost. And I guess we did get to that a little bit in talking about, like, maybe it allows people to kind of deflect away from some kind of deeper truth that the game is trying to explore. I made a game called Jostle Parent just by way of an example, which was it was meant to be. It's really hard. Like, I guess this is the whole thing about humor in games is stupid players and the paideia kind of impulse where people just kind of do whatever within the game system to see what happens without any sense of consequence, and often finding what happens funny just because it's their exploration of a possibility space. And Jostle Parent, in theory, was meant to be quite a serious, I don't know, like kind of a serious simulation of parenting in a sort of Atari style world where it was meant to be tragically funny, I guess. You can only push your children around and try and get them dressed and fed in the morning, and then you need to mow the lawn, but etc. But the whole thing about the game was that the children could die, which was meant to be sad, and no, it's tricky because I know that it is, at some level I know it's funny, but I was fighting against that, and maybe that's part of the tension of the game, and maybe it's more funny because I was trying to dissolve the comedy a little bit. So they die in very unfortunate ways, like being in ways that I think I actually picked the top 5 ways that children really die, which is pretty dark, and maybe that's why I was taking it more seriously. So they can die by being electrocuted, or eating poison in the garden, or choking on food, or crossing the road they can be hit by a car. and they really die. So the whole point of the game, and something I was interested in playing with at the time, was sort of permanence and not being able to indulge that kind of impulse to just be freewheeling that players have. So maybe you do it in the beginning, but then your child gets electrocuted. The game announces that they're dead. It cuts to a scene at their graveside where you and the remaining children kind of stand there for a bit, and then you go home, and then you kind of begin the day again, trying not to let your remaining two children die. If they all die, which it is a pretty hard game, so it's likely, then you just begin the day again, except you have no children. And nothing to do. It is, yeah, it's pretty dark. Now that I have a child, I don't know, I still stand behind it. I think it's an interesting experience. But yeah, there's this whole thing of, right, like, there is a slapsticky comedy to it. There's the incongruity of, even representing children dying in video games is not super common. And so maybe, potentially even for most players, it comes across as just like, haha, let's see all the different ways you can kill the kids. And they don't care, and they don't get any of the resonance around it being a tragedy. So maybe, comedy and tragedy. Like, I like comedy because I think it adds a lightness that makes games more accessible and makes people more likely to engage with them. But then if you're trying to do some other thing just slightly below that surface or adjacent to it, maybe the comedy tends to win out just because of the nature of play.
Yeah. Well, it's super interesting too, because this is such it can be a very sensitive subject matter, right? And so adding the joke, or adding, the Atari aesthetic, which might be considered humorous, or the gameplay elements. I think if you're trying to take the game seriously, maybe they make the game more palatable, like a very difficult topic.
Could
a
be
bit more.
Yeah.
Or
it's not a David Cage style exploration of your child's death or something.
Yeah. Or on the other hand, it can also lead to one of the most recurring discussions about this kind of stuff is when people play The Sims and would just leave their Sims in the pool. Is sort
Classic.
of the same kind of humor, I suppose.
It seems related. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it all comes down to whether or not people feel like they're in a position of superiority, right? Because that's the superiority humor of, haha, I'm going to laugh at terrible things happening to people, as opposed to sort of embodying that position.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
That's in theory, right? Game, empathy machine, etc. Like, it's meant to be something that games are good at, although they're not that good at it most of the time. Films somehow seem to do it better a lot of the time. Yeah. But they've had longer to figure it out, so we won't be too hard on games.
We'll get there at some point.
You should tell a joke either at the start or the end of your podcast. That would make a lot of sense to me.
Oh my God. We probably will.
Good.
I think. Do you want me to tell a joke now? I'm so terrible.
We could just get some canned laughter, and then you can throw it in afterwards.
There we go.
Use that.
To my muted co-hosts, is there anything else that either of you would like to ask, or do you feel like? Okay.
Yeah, my small child is still not in the house, so I do.
Cool. We talked a lot about the digital games you made, and I was last at those design meetings with you. You were also talking about making a more analog game with the call robot. And I was wondering if you view any differences around designing humor for like a digital experience versus humor for an analog experience.
I suspect that the short answer is I haven't thought about it enough, and I never finished that game. That was funny. I need to. I think I did. I never finished it just for sad technical reasons. I assume, to me, what was funny about that game, which was a game where you would use your phone to call a number, and it would it was a robo voice that would pretend that it couldn't hear you, basically. So it was like you had a bad connection to a robot, and it was like, "Hello, is anybody there?" etc. Which I thought was good. I guess it works in a distinct way. It works on a distinct platform, really, right? It's not a game. It's a comedy vehicle in an automatic phone answering system. So it has different connotations and different contexts that people bring to it, it's still leveraging that same basic idea of something that doesn't work the way that you want it to. And again, like, I guess maybe if we're talking about the superiority thing, like maybe a lot of what I'm interested in, if I did want to tie it back to that theory, is about positioning the player on the other side of the power spectrum. To react against, the obvious power fantasy version of games where everything's at a minimum is totally fair, and normally is not even fair and is biased towards the player. But yeah, it's a good reminder of that game, though. Thank you.
All right.
I called it a game. I call everything a game. Shouldn't do that. Lunch is a game.
That was great. That was a great highlight of those design meetings, for sure.
Yeah, it is a good idea. I'll get back to it. I will do it.
That was our interview with Dr. Pippin Barr. Thanks again to the Tag Lab for supporting this series, and thanks to you for listening.